Oh, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our first lecture of the 2023-2024 season here at the American Catholic Historical Society. My name is Dr. Tom Resnick. I'm a member of the Board of Managers of the Historical Society, and I'm the coordinator of our speakers series for the year. So it's wonderful to have people joining us here in person and braving the tropical storm that we're facing here in Philadelphia and on the East Coast, but also delighted that we have so many people joining us from all over the country via Zoom. So thank you very much. Just before we begin the talk, I wanted to sort of extend a word of welcome and say a few words about the American Catholic Historical Society. We are very proud to be the oldest Catholic historical society in the United States, founded in 1884. And we rely on the support of our members. And so if you are not yet a member of the Historical Society, we encourage you to join us. As part of membership, you get a wonderful subscription to our award-winning scholarly journal, American Catholic Studies, which is published quarterly. And you can find out more about the Historical Society by looking at our annual newsletter, which just came out earlier this month, and it has our full calendar of events for the remainder of the year. A copy of this newsletter is available on our website, so you can go and visit www.amchs.org to find out more about us. And in terms of being the nation's oldest Catholic Historical Society, it's a real treat this afternoon to hear a little bit about that early history. And so we have as our speaker today, Patrick Hayes, who is a fellow board member of the American Catholic Historical Society. He also serves as the archivist for the Redemptorist Fathers. The Redemptorist archives are located here in Philadelphia at St. Peter the Apostle Church on Girard Street. So it's sort of part of the rich Catholic history that we have here in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. In addition to sort of his work as archivist, Patrick Hayes is sort of author and editor of 6 books and countless articles, and is a prolific scholar in his own right. And so we're very delighted to have him joining us today to speak. And for those of you who are in attendance, we even have some show and tell to enjoy this afternoon. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Patrick. And as a reminder for anybody viewing at home, please feel free to add any comments that you may wish to share, comments and questions by using the chat or the Q&A feature. And we'll be monitoring that feed, and then I can sort of forward your questions to Patrick at the end of his presentation. So thank you, and I welcome Patrick Hayes to the podium.
Thank you, everyone. I really do give you a lot of credit for showing up on a day like today. And welcome to those of you who are tuning in at home. Am I coming through okay? Okay. I want to begin actually by thanking Dr. Resnick for the invitation to come and speak to you this afternoon. This isn't my first time doing so at the American Catholic Historical Society, which I'll call ACHS for short. When I was teaching, I gave a talk on my very first book here, which was on Catholic intellectual life after World War II. My second opportunity came a few years later when I gave a talk on a Civil War chaplain and his diary that I edited for publication. And in both instances, I used primary source material in composing the texts, but no one asked me anything about them. And as I recall, I didn't speak to that aspect of the book's production either. But this afternoon, that's exactly what I'm going to focus on. I want to talk about a primary source, the thing that historians crave not only for its authenticity and the ring of truth that it can bring to a story, but also because it can supply a narrative with some interesting nuggets of information about those who came before us. Let's see if this works. Hey, all right. In the first week of January of this year, when the American Catholic Historical Association last met in Philadelphia, I presented a conference paper on the early years of the ACHS, in whose townhouse a reception would be tendered the following day. Since I'll be referring to them both, it would be good to make a distinction between ACHA and ACHS. We're in the ACHS. This is an ACHS Zoom. Our guests were from the ACHA. It would not be the first time that the ACHS Clubhouse would be open to its more academic and younger sibling. In 1963, for example, during the 44th annual gathering, the business meeting and social hour took place at the Society's headquarters, which was then on Spruce Street in the former Biddle Mansion. In those days, only 3 conference sessions took place, and 2 of those were joint sessions with the American Historical Association, kind of the mothership of historians. And it was joined by the American Society of Church History. When ACHA members gathered at the ACHS, whose address had shifted here to 263 South 4th Street, their program had expanded to 34 sessions. Among the highlights of the 2023 meeting, however, was the conviviality, which took place after the Vigil Mass at Old St. Mary's, directly across the street from the Society's house. Many of the younger ACHA members had never before visited the townhouse or attended functions here, so as one of the few members of both organizations, I sought to introduce both professional historians to the history of the Society. Founded in 1884, it's America's oldest Catholic historical society. Its early membership built up a storehouse of artifacts, books, and manuscripts that reflected an earnest desire to give to the future something of the Church's past. To give a sense of the Society's early mission and activities, I went into a little used but important archive, which is now entirely accessible online, one of the Society's early scrapbooks. I'll speak more about the mechanics of the online version momentarily, but I want to stress that it's this document which speaks to a bygone era and also is filled with all kinds of data on late 19th century Catholics, their practices and interests, and their relationship to church history. When we think of church history as a discipline, one indicator of its value is the network of individuals who rallied around the concept, bestowed value on its enterprise, and sought to foster and preserve its findings in various ways. The ACHS Scrapbook number 2 does this in a kind of mini repository chronicling the actions of early members. It speaks about the people who came together, conscious of the possibility of loss. Their Catholicism was, they believed, something to record for posterity. They were alarmed that the contribution of Catholics to the nation was so little known, even among their co-religionists. They also believed that Catholicism was as much a part of high culture in a town known for its elites as any group that thought of itself as American. Philadelphia in the 1880s was a growing metropolis. In the 30-year interim consolidation in 1852 with its nearest suburban counties, Philadelphia added another 300,000 residents. So on average, about 100,000 people every year, every decade, with a high concentration of foreign-born citizens among them. By the time the ACHS was organized, the population had climbed to about 850,000, with no sign of abating. About 300,000 of its residents were Catholic, the bulk of which hailed from Ireland, Germany, and Poland. These ethnic groups shot into various economic sectors, such as the Irish, who between 1870 and 1880 dominated the building trades. The term contractor boss began to take hold in the popular imagination, where large-scale contracts gained currency in concert with graft-laden popular imagination. With graft-laden political machines. Many Catholics, such as John Mack, the asphalt king of the East Coast, took advantage of the city's Republican machine politics to further his own financial interests. For his loyalty, Mack was able to pave many roads throughout the Mid-Atlantic, including all those leading to the centennial celebrations in Philadelphia in 1876. Not incidentally, he was able to eventually invest in and become president of the Keystone Telephone Company, which held a monopoly on telephone cables running in and out of the city. Mack was also one of the founders of the Philadelphia Rapid Transit Company, which united several disparate transit lines into one unit. But he also worshiped at St. Dominic's Church in Torresdale, right alongside the Drexel family. We made things. From the soles on our shoes to Baldwin locomotives, we grew into a culture that prided itself on being the workshop of the world. This was a city on the move, too. By 1860, over 200 omnibuses were shuttling thousands of people around the city each day over 18 separate lines. Here you can see them in this railroad map. The lines are in red, crisscrossing every which way. Conveyance, the movement of goods and services, together with nearly a third of the city's greengrocers, were also powered by Catholics. Still, mass transit as such and large-scale manufacturing, such as the prodigious locomotive industry, remained in the hands of the city's Protestant barons. Except for the beneficial bank, financial institutions were also controlled by Protestants. But as Catholics grew in number, they began to form a solid middle class and enough capital both for investment and remuneration to immigrant homelands. Concomitantly, both Irish and German Catholic benevolent societies sprang up and undertook cooperative agreements in the late 1870s, knitting together two powerful Catholic volunteer agencies. As if to memorialize their presence, the Temperance Fountain was erected by Philadelphia Catholics in celebration of the nation's centennial in 1876. Their gift was water, something everyone needed. Their footprint would be large, indelible, and lasting. In the church, too, there was a freshness and optimism in the See of Philadelphia. Archbishop James Wood, who was hardly seen in the last 2 years of his episcopate, was succeeded by the renowned pulpit orator Patrick Ryan in July 1884. The new archbishop energized the city's Catholics and helped guide them through a boon in institutional growth. During his tenure, the archdiocese went from 100 to 250 parishes and from 75 to 141 schools. The Tipperary-born Ryan was a master at promoting group understanding and ecclesial cohesion, such that an individual's self-identity was formed in part by their nostalgic fealty to their home parish's buildings and boundaries. This translated into episcopal clout. One contemporary noted that Archbishop Ryan, quote, that for him, no municipal movement for the public weal is undertaken without his counsel. In other words, people in Philadelphia didn't make a move without him. Despite their unblinking confidence, it was thought that the Philadelphia juggernaut was becoming estranged from its Catholic heritage. The generation that knew firsthand struggles with know-nothingism and nativist sentiment was passing away, and the contemporary church was so busy moving forward, it neglected to look back. This was a driving concern among the ACHS founders. Insofar as they coalesced in a cooperative spirit, they formed an organization that served as a model for others around the United States. Similar Catholic historical societies in Western Pennsylvania, in Texas, New York City, and Portland in Oregon would eventually spring up to save local heritage materials from the dustbin. And barely a year prior to their formation, Pope Leo XIII had opened the Vatican archives for research, which was widely seen as a benchmark for the rejuvenation of church history using original sources. As collectors and donors of material Christianity, they knew they would not live to see how their heritage materials would be observed or critiqued, but they tried to make an enviable collection that is today housed on site at the ACHS House and in the Philadelphia Archdiocesan Catholic Historical Research Center. The Society's scrapbooks serve as but a partial inventory in the absence of any formal catalog or register of the many gifts made to it. For instance, news clippings pasted in its pages indicate a gold and diamond encrusted episcopal ring and pectoral cross given to Bishop Michael O'Connor of Pittsburgh, which were presented to the Society for its collections, as was the pectoral cross of Archbishop John Hughes of New York. These have all gone missing. Of the 336 pages of scrapbook number 2, the first few are an important window into the beginnings of the Society. You can see that the scrapbook itself has been digitized and is found among the Villanova University Library's digital collections. The thumbnails of every page are listed on the left-hand side of the screen. You can download each one individually and enlarge the size if need be. You can advance from page to page, just like reading through the physical book, but without causing any wear or tear on the object itself. Notwithstanding some hiccups in the cataloging process, the site for scrapbook number 2 is relatively straightforward. It's just a few mouse clicks and you can manipulate the text easily. The history of the ACHS that was subsequently drawn from the memory of aging members and eventually recorded in the Society's journal must be balanced by attention to the more contemporaneous accounts pasted into the scrapbook. These are vital primary sources for a true rendition of the facts of who was involved, where, and when. But even here, though, context matters, and the details of the scrapbook's contents are supplied in an examination of the roles of the individual principals, which I'm going to develop now. On the inside cover and in the first pages of the scrapbook, one finds the handwritten text of an invitation, dated July 4th, 1884, sent to prominent Catholics in Philadelphia to meet in the clubhouse of the cathedral's total abstinence, I can't even say it. That's the Irishman in me. The cathedral's Total Abstinence Benevolent Society, also known as the Cathedral Hall, at 16th and Vine Streets on July 22nd, 1884. On the opposite side is the printed invitation, which together with a list of signatures of those who helped to organize and sponsor the gathering. This was a meeting called jointly by area priests and lay people, but credit for the idea goes to 2 laymen, Martin I.J. Griffin, an erstwhile church history buff and local publisher, whose writing desk graces one of the first floor parlors in the ACHS house. My lovely wife, Rachel, is sitting in front of it, modeling the desk for us. Additionally, John H. Campbell, a local attorney, was also instrumental. It was Campbell who composed the draft invitation, but this grew from more embryonic and far-reaching discussions the 2 men had over several years. In the months leading to the July invitation, they had been conversing about articles that Griffin had printed between 1882 and 1884 on Catholicity in Philadelphia. From these talks came both a practical idea for preservation of Philadelphia's Catholic history, but also was formed the kernel of the spirit of the work. At first, the 2 thought it would be best to simply pack the Historical Society of Pennsylvania with Catholics, but they eventually abandoned the notion in favor of a freestanding society devoted to local Catholic history. Griffin and Campbell were joined by the following: Campbell's brother, Dr. William Campbell, MD, the Reverend Thomas Middleton, OSA, Francis T. Fury, J. Carroll McCaffrey, Charles H.A. Eastling, Reverend Patrick A. Jordan, S.J., Reverend Ignatius Horstman, the future Bishop of Cleveland, the Reverend Philip Beresford, Reverend John Elcock, and Francis X. Royce. One could call this collective the Invitation Committee. On July 22nd, the following met in the Cathedral Hall: George Wolfe, the editor of the Catholic Standard, Dr. Michael O'Hara, MD, William Gorman, lawyer, Bernard and Atlee Durdur, Thomas Westcott, Dr. E.J. Nolan, MD, Robert McWade, city editor of the Ledger, and Reverend Thomas McMillan, a Paulist visiting from New York. He was just an accidental person to show up. They joined several of those on the invitation committee: Middleton, the Campbells, Griffin, and Royce, and selected John Campbell as temporary president and Martin Griffin as secretary. To gain some insight into their standing in the Catholic community and to see how these founders, or this founders meeting, brought the whole question of Catholic history to the attention of the wider church, it's worth singling out a few for a brief comment. The first is Father Middleton, whose portrait graces the front room of the Society's second floor. If you haven't been to the second floor of the house afterward, please take some time, pay your respects to Father Middleton. An Augustinian friar who served as Villanova College's librarian from 1865 to 1923, Middleton's service in that capacity remained unbroken even when he became the college's president between 1876 and 1878. He wouldn't let go of the library even when he served as president. His extraordinary organizational talents were matched by his passion for Catholic history. It was Father Middleton who was elected the Society's first president, a role he held between 1884 and 1890. Middleton had deep connections to Catholic Philadelphia and helped cement and grow useful networks. Indeed, Father Middleton's family once owned an estate in the northern reaches of the city in Chestnut Hill. When he was Bishop of Philadelphia, St. John Newman brokered it to be turned over to the Sisters of St. Joseph as the site of their mother house. Middleton was also the first to deliver a public address on behalf of the Society, a tradition that continues with some regularity to this day, even me. It took place in April 1885 at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, a much larger venue, very grand, and completely dedicated to historical pursuits. His subject was the importance of Catholic historical studies. He was followed later that month by Monsignor Robert Seaton, who spoke on the history of historical societies to a large audience that included, among others, Archbishop Patrick Ryan. The drawing power of their intellect was such that the rooms of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania were required to accommodate the crowd. The presence of the Archbishop meant that the ACHS had garnered a certain cachet, but also signaled that the Catholics in Philadelphia were as much a part of Pennsylvania's historical development as any of our Protestant forebears. The ACHS would never return to the Total Abstinence Benevolent Society across from the cathedral. Perhaps no other member served the society so well and so resourcefully as Martin Griffin. He was the Society's visionary. It is Griffin who developed the Society's journal that we know today as American Catholic Studies. but long before he was an earnest advocate for the educative function of such an organization. As the Society's work gained steam, Griffin realized that a journal would be a useful vehicle for promoting its events as well as the study of church history through a regular publication. Accordingly, in January 1887, Griffin acquired the Journal of the newly defunct Ohio Valley Catholic Historical Society, which went by the title The Historical Researches in Western Pennsylvania, Principally Catholic, a publication which began under the auspices of the noted church historian Father Andrew Lambing of Pittsburgh. Griffin continued its publication under the name American Catholic Historical Researches, slightly different from what we call our journal today, which is marked by a popular style, but it's filled with hard-to-find nuggets mined from Catholic newspapers and occasional sermons sent to Philadelphia from across the country. So he kind of ingested a lot of this very disparate Catholic information, and in a digest form, printed it in his journal. This he also continued to edit until his death in Philadelphia on November 10th, 1911. Griffin's diverse and zealous habits of collecting vast quantities of Catholica now form the core of the Society's 19th century collections. His own papers are a significant source of information on the contributions of the Irish to ecclesial life in the United States, as well as the Catholic contribution of the cause of the Revolution. Griffin was born in Philadelphia in October 1842 and was from an early age a regular contributor to and editor of various Catholic publications, including the Irish Catholic Benevolent Union Journal, which had national reach, and the more localized Griffin's Journal. He cut his teeth as a writer and editor at the Philadelphia Archdiocesan newspaper, the Catholic Standard and Times. In 1872, he was made secretary of the Irish Catholic Benevolent Union, and both founded and edited its journal from 1873 to 1894. The account ledgers in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia's archive indicate a charitable streak in his character that propelled and consumed him until his death in 1911. Not to belabor too much about Griffin, but his work for Philadelphia Irish has been so understudied. It really ought to change, and we have so much material. He never threw anything away. His offices must have been a rat's nest of paper, but we're the beneficiaries of it. By Griffin's own account, he wasn't alone in forming the Society. Among his fellow travelers was John Hugh Campbell, who lived from 1847 to 1897, a lawyer originally from Germantown. Campbell was also a writer and active member of several Philadelphia-based associations. Along with his brother, Dr. William James Campbell, John was a member of the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick and the Hibernian Society of Philadelphia. So you can see between Griffin's work in the Irish Catholic Benevolent Union, the Friendly Sons, and the Hibernian Society, we have a good portion of Irish Catholic Philadelphia covered in these two men. As the Society's historian, Campbell authored Friendly Sons of St. Patrick and Hibernian Society for the Relief of Immigrants from Ireland, 1871 to 1892. A copy of which is actually upstairs in our library under Father Middleton's watchful gaze. He also served as the editor of the Legal Gazette here in town and the CTA News. For 11 years, he served as the president of the Catholic Total Abstinence Union of Philadelphia. William James Campbell graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with doctorates in medicine and philosophy in 1871 and succeeded his father in the book and publishing business. William was a member of the Catholic Total Abstinence Union of Philadelphia and was president of St. Malachy's Total Abstinence Society. In addition to being a charter member of the ACHS, he was president of the City History Society and a member of the Young Men's Democratic Association. William James Campbell authored the collection of Franklin imprints in the Museum of the Curtis Publishing Company, a catalog of rare Frankliniana. A sister of these men is worthy of note. Sarah James Campbell, 1844 to 1928, she's there on the right, known simply as Jane Campbell, was a prolific writer and speaker, frequently contributing to Philadelphia newspapers, such as The Record, The Inquirer, and The Public Ledger. A strong supporter of women's suffrage, in 1892, she founded the Women's Suffrage Society of Philadelphia and served as its president for 22 years. She also was on the executive board of the Pennsylvania Women's Suffrage Association and represented Philadelphia in the American Women's Suffrage Association. She edited a magazine called Women's Progress, which was founded by her sister, Mary Ann Campbell, shown here on the left. Sarah Jane was also active in the ACHS, for which she served as recording secretary for a time, as well as the City History Society of Philadelphia, the New Century Club, the Audubon Society, St. Vincent's Aid Society, the Civic Club, the Mercantile Club, and the Current Events Club of Germantown. Oh, and the Women's Press Club. Busy ladies. Not incidentally, John Campbell and Martin Griffin were neighbors in this city. Campbell lived at 740 Sansom Street, and Griffin lived at 711 Sansom Street. Their proximity helped form an easy friendship. Griffin and Campbell actually had spent the previous 2 years hatching their plan and enlisting others, but in early July 1884, in Griffin's office at the Irish Catholic Benevolent Union, they formalized it. They asked a core group to meet on July 22nd in the Cathedral's Temperance Association and Benevolent Society at the Cathedral Hall. 13 men attended the gathering, which elected Campbell as the first president pro tem. Griffin was elected secretary pro tem, and the two set to work on the formation of a constitution and bylaws, which were ratified later that year. The formal elections placed Father Middleton in the president's chair. Again, if you go up to the second floor, you can see our charter. It's a little stained but not worse for wear. It's still valid. While the early founders did not include women, they were never excluded. In fact, they came into the society very quickly and took up positions within the organization very soon after the inaugural meeting. In 1885, Miss Margaret T. Green of 503 Pine Street is listed as the sole woman on the board of managers. But that tells you something. Already within the first year, there's the presence of women on the board. She taught school for several years in this city. We don't see her in subsequent listings, probably because she moved to Chicago with her new husband sometime before 1887. But another early female participant was the suffragette Jane Campbell, a sister of John and William. She kept her own scrapbooks, mostly detailing the foundational aspects of the voting rights movement. These are now at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. However, it would be disingenuous to say that the early years of the ACHS were considered a period of equality. Women have always been in a minority, even when they held the presidency. As an aside, to mark their relative absence, I selected a photograph from the library company to illustrate just how women have struggled to be included in the photographic history of the ACHS. Not a single one of these women sat for this photograph. In the years before Photoshop, their heads were all placed on posed bodies to create the effect of their presence. Trust me, they're not there. So John Campbell let those assembled on July 22nd he let them know that the hall was able to be used for meetings until such time as the society could stand on its own. Meanwhile, the hall would also serve as a storehouse for the society's cabinet, a large closet that soon filled with Catholic documents, books, and ephemera of all kinds. You have to imagine in the cathedral hall, the cabinet was probably the broom closet. So from humble beginnings, all of this. The gathering of those items soon became unwieldy, and within weeks, the board sought more capacious accommodations. Griffin had the job of curating it all, and so enjoyed the work that he remained a close collaborator with the Society's librarian for the rest of his life. Not incidentally, Griffin imparted the love of history and of the church to his family as well. His son was a priest secretary to Archbishop John Ireland in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and administrator at the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis. Griffin also had a daughter who was a nun. But his grandson, who was cut down a little too short in life, his grandson also bore his name, Martin Griffin, and he rose to become a very talented church historian at Yale, but died in his 50s. As the activities of the society began to captivate the imagination of more and more people, the demand for more outward-facing work intensified. The society quickly developed a reputation for serious scholarly inquiry and began to draw important church historians, notable clergy, and subject specialists to lecture almost monthly. You think you have a tough job now, Tom. Almost monthly, our program committee was that active. Before audiences at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and later at the Catholic Philopatrian Society. Organizing a formal committee to handle public programs was the brainchild of a local physician, not yet 30, named Lawrence Flick. A graduate of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, Flick, who lived from 1856 to 1938, was a pioneer in tuberculosis research. Aided by a parish sodality, he also founded in 1895 the Free Hospital for Poor Consumptives. A prolific researcher and author of several medical texts, Flick's hobby was Catholic history. He set to work engaging a steady stream of speakers. Flick had that rare combination of industry and magnetism, just so enviable, and the power of his intellect couldn't be beat. Accordingly, he was elected president of the ACHS twice. He served between 1893 and 1896, and again between 1913 and 1914. For his contribution to church and society, he was awarded Notre Dame's Laetare Medal in 1920, which is now on display next to his portrait in the Society's house, again up on the second floor. He's buried actually across the street in Old St. Mary's. After the Society's constitution and bylaws were ratified in December 1884, a formal election took place, but not without some criticism toward the Society. In the German language newspaper Nordamerica, printed from the ethnic parish of St. Peter the Apostle on North 5th Street, an editorial took the Society to task for apparently leaving out the German community in the Society's development. And all these Irishmen running around. The Germans were flexing. But instead of this kerfuffle, we find a long note penned by Francis X. Royce, one of the Society's first members. He describes his actions to resolve the matter, but in doing so, we gain an important clue about who assembled the scrapbook. It's none other than Royce himself. While people like Griffin and Campbell were more interested in salvaging documents and other items from the period of the American Revolution, Royce had an eye for the detritus of contemporary Catholic life, at least those that could be pasted into a scrapbook. Royce's scrapbooking extends well beyond the pages of scrapbook number 2. He compiled at least 2 other fat volumes, and here is a sampling. Not only was Royce a founder of the ACHS, an active observer of Catholic life in the Archdiocese, the scrapbook contains a news clipping about Royce's affiliation to the ACHS, calling him a specialist. His line of work is the collection of manuscripts of the archbishops, bishops, and heads of religious orders in the United States. Can you imagine having that as your full-time job? Well, it wasn't his full-time job, but he put an awful lot of time into it. To earn his keep, Royce owned a music shop and was an operatic singer in his younger days. Eventually, he became a renowned choir director and attended numerous performances of visiting choirs and concerts throughout the Archdiocese. You have to imagine Catholic life back then, one of the wholesome activities that took place within the confines of the parish. Concerts, routinely, which were also fundraisers. In any case, he made the rounds to these concerts as a matter of course. He was also a publisher and author. In addition to his several articles in the records, which included a painstaking transcription of all of the baptismal and marriage registers at Old St. Joseph's around the corner from us, Royce also authored the biographical cyclopedia of the Catholic hierarchy in the United States. Let me tell you, that is an enormously tedious job. This bishop was born here on such and such a day. This bishop was assigned as a priest to this and this parish until on such and such a day, he was consecrated the bishop of such and such. One after another, in the hundreds. In any case, Royce's scrapbook is important not only for the history of the ACHS, but it's a valuable instrument for the study of the Catholic and secular press in multiple languages, and not simply of newspapers based in Philadelphia. He received clippings from around the United States that somehow spoke to the interests of ACHS members or covered society events. Royce's scrapbook supplied a remarkably broad spectrum of ephemera. We learn about the memorialization of missions, catalogs and policies of the libraries of church sodalities, parish social outings, often outside the city, down the shore, or in parkland, lectures, mass schedules, concerts, entertainments, fairs, and building projects. These evoke a kind of saturated Catholic culture that one could find in several pockets around the city. The links between Irish benevolent and charitable organizations, cultural institutes, such as the Philopatrians, and local temperance societies is also notable for the cooperation exhibited and the cross-pollination of these Catholic groups. I have to say, if these tickets weren't color-coded, they should have been. They're so pretty to look at. They're examples of what, in the absence of an email system, they're communication devices for 19th century Catholics. More formally, let's see here. More formally, the founders' collecting habits evolved into a twofold collection portfolio. For the library, books were sought about Catholics and Catholic missions, sketches and catalogs of schools, academies, and colleges, records of proceedings of Catholic history, religious or scientific bodies, journals and newspapers, manuscripts, magazines, pamphlets, as well as church almanacs, directories, and diaries. For the cabinet, prints, especially of persons and church buildings, pictures, medals, utensils, relics, and any article of value from its historical or biographical affinities. All of these items began to be gathered within the walls of another venerable and even older Philadelphia society, the Catholic Philopatrian Society at 12th and Walnut, which had graciously offered rooms to the nascent ACHS. In September 1885, Griffin could report that the new society had received 367 items in the space of 2 months' time, but that by the annual meeting in December, that number increased to 988. At the July 1886 meeting, barely 7 months later, at the Board of Managers, a report of Francis X. Royce spoke of the books, prints, newspapers, and other materials housed at the Philo, a cache of nearly 2,700 items, including 2 editions of the first Catholic Bible printed in the United States by Matthew Carey. These have since gone missing too. Soon the question arose about the placement of so much Catholica. The quantity was cumbersome for the Philo, so more commodious accommodations were secured at the Athenaeum. But even here, the library's enormity could not be checked, and the Board of Managers began raising funds for a home of their own. It took a while, but the Society was able to move its collections from a more permanent space into a more permanent space in 1895, when it purchased the former Biddle Mansion on Spruce Street. For the next 7 decades, members enjoyed this handsome building, which could continue to accession important Catholic heritage materials. From the ACHS, when the ACHS moved to its present home in 1963, it had divested much of its collection in favor of the Archdiocesan Seminary. This took place in 1932, though the Society continues to own the stock of items entrusted to it over the years. One could say a great deal about the utility of scrapbooking, particularly for classroom teaching, and I could be much more descriptive about how the ACHS Scrapbook number 2 is a time capsule for Catholic Philadelphia in the 19th century. But as you can see, from some of the scrapbooks I've assembled here on the front desk, sorry to those of you who are at home, I brought out a couple of our scrapbooks from upstairs. The condition of these treasures prompts me to make a small plea to those who are here and to those online. Our scrapbooks, as well as many hundreds of newspapers, magazines, and other important heritage materials, are suffering under the advance of time. The paper is becoming brittle and bindings are falling apart. And so to address this, we're embarking on a very large and mostly uphill battle, and we need your help. If you're not a member of the ACHS, we need you. It will be one way to beef up our financial abilities to properly assess and conserve our collections before they literally fall apart. If you can help with a further financial gift to bring stability and accessibility to our collections, not unlike scrapbook number 2, we want to hear from you. It's true that we're a society charged with looking backward, but we want to make our Catholic legacy available to future generations. The digitization of scrapbook number 2 is one example of how we can do this. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions if you have them. Sure. Well, I've stunned the folks who are gathered here into silence.
Well, we do have one question that's come in online. This comes from Joseph Cohn of the Archdiocese of Portland. And you may want to repeat the question for those listening in. But do the scrapbooks and other historical records indicate that the society actually paid attention to and documented the contributions of German Catholics, or did they remain largely Irish focused?
Well, it's a fine question. Okay, so Joe Cohen from the Diocese of Brooklyn Archives, an old pal of mine, wants to know if this was a society basically dominated by Irish Americans, or did we let in the occasional German? And the answer is, it's tough to say. If you are the right kind of German, the door was open. And by that, I mean someone kind of serious, scholarly, capable in English. You have to remember Philadelphia in the 19th century. If you happen to be German living in certain neighborhoods, the language that you heard in your neighborhood was German. If you ventured outside of your neighborhood, it could be a foreign country. There was this thickness or tightness of culture. In St. Peter the Apostle Parish, which happens to be my parish, for many decades, it was a German parish. Easily 90 to 95% of the people who went there spoke German. They spoke German at home. They taught it in the parochial school, and only World War I changed that. So if you could get by in English, you were more than welcome. And fortunately, the city had many capable and scholarly and historically minded German Catholics. And I think one of the rallying points for German Catholic presence here was the fact that the German Historical Society, which is over on Spring Garden Street, was largely a Lutheran organization. The German Catholics needed a place to go. And so we were the only game in town, so they joined the Irish. The Poles and the Italians, I have to say, came later. But now we're universal. Anybody's welcome here. Okay.
How many scrapbooks are there in total?
That's a good question. There are 3 that are digitized that pertain strictly to the history of the society. All of them are falling apart, to be honest. It's really kind of a sadness that our own society's history has managed to weather the ages up until this point. But it is a darn good thing that they are digitized. And we have Villanova University, our great partner, to thank for that. So now anyone can have access to them, anyone with an internet connection. But there are dozens more. So I brought down 2 that we happen to have at our society. One we know is from Martin Griffin and his days as a member of the Catholic Total Abstinence Union. It describes in intricate detail, I would say intricate detail, what Irish Catholic life was like in the late 19th century in this town. It's all documented, but the pages are quite fragile. Another describes a later scrapbook, also pertaining to the society, but not one of the ones that have been digitized. I think it begins in the 1890s and goes early into the 20th century. But the binding is falling off. We have them on book cradles now, and I have to say, because we're such a small audience, I figured it was safe to bring them out. But if we had folks thumbing through the pages, they would just crumble in their hands. So
This question is from Mary Brown, who's asking, regarding the digitization of the scrapbook, do you take items out and digitize them? She asks because they have scrapbooks with different things in them that might be of individual interest. So kind of about kind of excerpting one item in order to digitize it as a standalone item.
Right. So my understanding is that sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. So in our scrapbook number 2, the binding of the scrapbook, which is this really quite fat ledger book, the binding was broken. It was easy to pluck out individual pages to lie them flat to be photographed. You can't do that with every scrapbook. If they are of a certain age and the quality is more or less going south, they can be broken. As long as the text on the pages can be captured. And these days, depending on the camera that you use, there is a flattening technology. Even if the pages are curved, you can smooth them out. It's really quite remarkable.
Do you have a favorite item that you came across in thumbing through these scrapbooks?
Any historian will tell you that primary sources are kind of like the launching pad. So the very first page is actually the cover of scrapbook number 2. You have the outside cover, but on the inside, you have the individuals who penned the invitation to get people out from their comfort zone and meet. And I think that kind of just spun its own web for me. I love the fact that things have to start somewhere. And part of the historian's goal is to figure out, where does it actually start? That thing that you're investigating, you can't find it really in the pages of the journal. That's the sanitized version. And I will say that the people who wrote about the society's early history were frequently wrong. They assign this person to do this job or this person to do that job. Completely wrong. Because they're recollecting after a period of 20 or 30 years. They just don't have the information that they had back then. So seeing how things played out in the scrapbook format, you get a truer picture of what happened to bring this about. So right from the very start, I think my favorite is at the beginning.
And we have one other question. This comes from Marianne Squires, asking, is the ACHS perceived by the academic community as a valuable resource for advancing research in relevant historical areas? Could they not be enlisted to help in the conservation of these valuable collections?
Great, again, a great question. So Marianne Squires wants to know if academics look to the ACHS for scholarly sources, and shouldn't and couldn't they lend a hand with preservation? And I say all hands on deck at this point. We need everyone who has the ability to join in the crusade to preserve your own Catholic history and your own research materials. These things are very rich, but they're unique. And once they go, you'll never get them back. So I am pleading you, begging you. They're so worth having around. And the way in which we can manipulate them so that everybody can have access to them, I think that's a win for everyone. It's a win for the world.
no questions, please join me in thanking Patrick for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.